Hello, and welcome back to Glitterature Alley. I am Tootight Lautrec, the master mistress of Glitterature Alley, and here we are once again at the bottom of the down staircase in the permanently sequestered remainders section of an unnamed local library, which may or may not have two extensively detailed lions couchant on the front steps, going absolutely nowhere. And not even going nowhere fast, just going ponderously, heavily nowhere. Now, do these illustrious lazy lions have anything possibly in common with this week's selection for Pulitzer Who? Spoiler alert. Yes, indeed. Those excruciatingly detailed, lifeless stone lions have quite a bit in common with this week's clunker, the 1934 winner of the Pulitzer Prize for the novel, Lamb in His Bosom by Caroline Miller. Clunk. But before we get to Lamb in His Bosom, this novel, which I will put in quotes, this lugubrious muck of a novel, let's first look at a few other books that were published in 1933, which were passed over, passed over for the Pulitzer Prize. Now, of course, there were always the Yellery Queens, the Hardy Boys, the Nancy Drews, the Wizard of Oz's, and the Tarzan books that come out almost every year around this time. But none of those were in contention for the Pulitzer Prize. But there were books like Anne Vickers by Sinclair Lewis, Better Angels by Foreman Brown under the pseudonym Richard Meeker, which was republished in 1951 as the novel Torment, which is apparently considered the first homosexual novel with a truly happy ending. So I will have to look into Better Angels by Foreman Brown at some point, and maybe I'll let you know how it goes. But also published that year was a book called The Farm by Louis Bromfield of Early Autumn fame, which I loved. Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder, God's Little Acre by Erskine Caldwell, Miss Lonely Hearts by Nathaniel West, which was nothing like what I thought it would be. It's really a very dark, dark novel, but I did sort of enjoy it anyway. And To A God Unknown by John Steinbeck. Now, these were just a few of the books that the Pulitzer Committee could have considered for the Pulitzer Prize, but did they give it to any of them? No. They decided to cast off all those other illustrious books in order to give it to Caroline Miller's book, Lamb in His Bosom. So, Caroline Pafford, as she was born August 26, 1903, and she lived until July 12, 1992. She was born in Waycross, Georgia. She graduated from high school and then married her high school English teacher, a Mr. William D. Miller. And she once said of him, "He was my college," which she said after she won the Pulitzer Prize and shortly before she divorced him. So she apparently wrote short stories while raising their three children and gathered material for Lamb in His Bosom by talking to people in backwoods Georgia while buying chickens and eggs and gathered their stories. Lamb in His Bosom was her debut novel, and it also won the Prix Femina, which is a French prize given by an all-female panel to normally books that were published in the French language, which this was not. So I don't understand that at all. Number one, how she could have won the Pulitzer. Number two, how she could have won another prize. Number three, how she would have won a prize for books that were written in French when this was written in English. So if you haven't guessed, my most succinct review of this book, hated it. And I'll tell you why. This is a book of well-written, evocative description, mostly of landscape, followed by more evocative, well-written description, mostly of landscape, followed by more well-written, evocative evocative description mostly of landscape ad nauseum. Now, let me just give you a description from the back of the novel so that you can beware back of book novel descriptions. In this transcendent tale of love and loss in the Old South, a woman and her family struggle to build their lives deep in the Georgia backwoods among poor settlers who never owned a slave or planned to fight a war. Well, never owned a slave is pronounced here as if it's some really wonderful thing, but they didn't own a slave not because they didn't want to, or not because they understood or saw the horrifying injustice and cruelty of enslaving other human beings. No, they just couldn't afford it. And at one point, one of the characters thinks of how nice it would be to have a buck and a wench that they could breed to get a whole bunch of slaves to do all the work that they don't like to do. So not terribly noble the way that it's described here. And as far as the war is concerned, they're talking about the Civil War, which takes up maybe 3 pages of this novel, where the men go off to war and then they come back bedraggled and all worn out, having fought for slaves and having fought for the right for the South to keep slaves, and having lost. That's all. There's not really any much more mention of the war in here. So it's set in antebellum backwoods Georgia, and the main character, if we can call a name on a page a character, is a woman named Cean Smith, spelled C-E-A-N, Smith, who marries, has 14 children, farms the land, watches many of her family grow and sometimes die. And the story, anyone? Anyone? No, me neither. Apparently life on a farm is rough. And we needed this to tell us that. There is almost no dialect in this book. 368 pages, mostly of exposition. Her descriptions of farm life are wonderful, extensive, but wonderful, to the point where I had more feeling for a calf that was being slaughtered than I did for any of the characters who were presented as human beings, because those characters never came to life as full characters. And I think that it's noteworthy that in this edition, at least, the afterword praising this book is written by a historian who emphasizes the realistic description of backwoods life, as if a realistic description of backwoods life is all that is necessary for a novel to do. And it is not. A novel has to have a story. It has to have characters who act. It has to have something that propels the story, a beginning and a middle and an end. So also, in my admonition, beware of book blurbs, is Sinclair Lewis, who says, there is a fine sense of beauty here. Yes, he's correct. There is a fine sense of beauty here. No story, no substance, but sure, beauty, as if that's all you need. It's not. Beauty uncoupled from depth of character, purpose, action, agency, or risk quickly becomes tedium. And not to put too dull a point on it, this book was a slog for me. It took me a long time to read, not just because it's almost all exposition, but it just was so, it took me a long time to read. That's all I'm saying. And don't get me wrong, clear, well-crafted description is vital to a good novel, but so is plot. Description should, number one, give glimpses into the complicated human condition, okay? Number two, it should reveal the quirks and absurdities and the gloriously surprising facets of many kinds of different personalities. It should advance the action, it should reveal a twist possibly, and it should set the stage for what will happen. But something must happen. And it should set the stage for the characters to act. And if characters do not act, to somehow change their situation, whether they succeed or whether they fail, if there are no consequences for the actions that they take, there is no story. And this is a book in which life just seems to happen over and over and over. This happens, that happens. It happens to this character, Cian Smith, but it's just life happening to a character. It's not as if there are no events. It's just that none of them are are actions that are propelled by or originating from any main character. They're just, oh, this happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me. I mean, it's not a first person narrative, but it reads almost like it's very close third person for Cian, and things just happen to her all throughout the novel, but not because of anything she does. So, above all, in a novel, there has to be some sort of tension to drive a story forward. And nothing sets up tension like expectation, whether it's a comedy or a tragedy or an adventure. So, for instance, sometimes in a book, a tragedy is announced right at the very beginning, and the tension builds to find out how what happened happened. In a mystery, an event that's either upsetting or glorious opens the novel, and the story goes on to flesh out the details and to answer questions about the mystery. In a love story, obstacles to the love, whatever love situation is occurring, obstacles create tension between two characters until love is either satisfied or thwarted. In a quest type of novel, a situation spurs a desire for change, and the characters set out on a journey to seek change, and whether they succeed or fail determines the fate of the novel, but sometimes they learn something new along the way. In a novel of self-discovery, which I contend Jane Austen's Emma is one of those novels, Emma Woodhouse, the main character, has this, at the very beginning, has a very firm idea of who she is and what she wants. But as the novel progresses, these ideas dissolve, and she learns that she's nothing like what she thought she was, and that what she thought she wanted isn't exactly anything like what she actually does want. So that's a self-discovery novel. And in a satire, for instance, personalities clash, but you need to create characters with personalities before they can clash. In Lamb in His Bosom, there are no personalities. There are only names of characters. And sometimes we find out the color of their hair. Sometimes we find out how tall they are. Desires, fears, yearnings, ambitions, nada, nunca, nine, yet, nothing. And yet, I am happy to have read this book because I find that I often learn more from bad art than from good art. In really excellent, stupendous fiction, sometimes it's difficult for me to see how a great writer does or accomplishes certain feats that they do accomplish, usually because I'm so immersed in the story or in the world that the writer has created that it's hard for me to step out of that world to to critically think about how they accomplished what they accomplished. But in bad fiction, such as Lamb in His Bosom, the curtain splits open and you see the writer behind the curtain, and all of the flaws become apparent. And this is important if you, for instance, aspire to write fiction, because then you can articulate what to avoid. Number one, you can avoid overly detailed description that goes nowhere, or description for the sake of description and for nothing else. And I was thinking about Proust and Remembrance of Things Past. He's that's an overly detailed novel of description too, but it does finally go somewhere. It's not like it doesn't. If you read the first 60 pages until they get to the point of the Petite Madeleine, all of what had come before kind of condenses into that one moment, and it's really an amazingly powerful thing. So that description was not for naught. So, but here Overly detailed description goes nowhere. Characters with names but no personalities goes nowhere. Avoid it. Dialogue isn't always important to every kind of novel, but it's important in many kinds of novels because not only does it break up the tedium of the page, but it actually acts as action sometimes. It can delineate character without using exposition. It can create drama. It can create laughs. It can create fears and tears and aversions, all without having to say that that's what's happening. And so I am grateful for Lamb in His Bosom for reinforcing my awareness of these aspects of fiction. So now, what kept me reading, or what stopped me reading Lamb in His Bosom? Stopped me? Well, other than falling asleep, there were multiple times where I was tempted to stop. And not only that, multiple times where I was tempted to stop and toss the book across the window, across the room and out the window, but I was afraid of hurting someone with this book. And so I didn't do that. And what kept me reading is because I cannot fully pan a novel without a full awareness of how wholly bad it is. So that's what kept me reading. I had to have something to talk about, and I couldn't just say I stopped reading it and it's crap, as they say, without really knowing for sure that it was. And now I do know for sure that it is. Qualms. Do I have qualms? Well, see all of the above. Plus, have I mentioned dialect? Well, you may have thought that a book set in backwoods Georgia would have a significant amount of dialect, but in a book without much dialogue, there couldn't be much dialect. But you would be wrong. There is almost no dialogue in this book, and yet Caroline Miller finds a way to insert dialect into the middle of a sentence of exposition or a paragraph or a description for no reason at all, and then slip back to standard dictionary English by the end of the sentence for reasons that I can't even fathom. That it's just dumb. I don't understand. It's not even that it's so closely into the other person's um, thought process that it needs to be described in a dialectical way. It's just it's just bad writing as far as I'm concerned. Grr. Again, with dialect, I do love dialect when it's done well, and but this, no. Do I recommend it? Well, let me tell you, if you are a creative writing teacher and you hate your students and you want to pound into their heads the evils of excessive description that goes nowhere, then yes, wholeheartedly, I recommend it. Otherwise, emphatically, no, I do not recommend Lamb in His Bosom by Caroline Miller, which won the Pulitzer Prize for the novel in 1934. Look for wonder elsewhere. It's all around you. Well, maybe not all around you, but it's around you. Look for it. And when you find it, pay attention to it because you deserve it. That's all for this week's episode of Pulitzer Who. I am Tootight Lautrec. Until we meet again. Mwah.